All right. Good evening, good morning, and good afternoon. Welcome to the 2021 APRU Sustainable Cities and Landscapes webinar series. Today's session is our fourth webinar session in our series. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Yegang Ko. I'm the Program Director of the APRU Sustainable Cities and Landscapes Hub and the Associate Professor of Landscape Architecture at the University of Oregon. Before we get started, today's webinar, I just want to mention a couple of things about APRU and Sustainable Cities and Landscapes program. For those of you who are not familiar with APRU, APRU is the Association of Pacific Rim Universities. It's a network of 60 leading universities linking the Americas, Asia, and Australasia. We leverage collective education and research capabilities of our members into the international public policy process. The Sustainable Cities and Landscapes program is one of the APRU's primary research programs to collaborate on effective solutions to the challenges of the 21st century. And the Scl Hub has now 19 core members across the Pacific Rim, and the hub is housed at the University of Oregon. The Scl Hub successfully held 4 annual conferences in Poland, Hong Kong, Sydney, and Auckland, with a total of 450 participants. And each conference offered various activities that students can participate in, such as research working groups, design field school, student design competition, and research symposium for PhD students. So our 22 conference is scheduled in Honolulu, Hawaii, so stay tuned. This year, instead of our annual conference, we offer a live webinar series organized by our working groups, celebrating our 5th year. Starting from mid-August, there will be 10 bi-weekly thematic webinars until mid-December this year. So after today's webinar, the next webinar will be hosted by Professor Linda Corkery and Professor Kate Bishop from the University of New South Wales. And the webinar title is Children, Youth and Environment, Resilience and Resourcefulness in a COVID World. And this will be on October 14th, 11 a.m. in Sydney and 8 a.m. in Hong Kong, and which will be October 13th, 5 p.m. for Americas. Be careful about the daylight savings. And this webinar will address the setting and experience of daily life for children and young people, home and neighborhood, school, places for play and recreation, shared public space, and the digital environment. The presenters will discuss the influence of public policy, urban design, environmental quality, social equity, and inclusion of children's development, health, and well-being, and agency, resilience, particularly in the context of COVID-19. So I hope you continue to join us and explore how cities and regions across the Pacific Rim address the climate change and social equity to achieve the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. Please contact us through email and visit our website and Facebook or Instagram if you're interested in participating in our activities. And thank you so much for joining. And I'd like to hand it over to our today's moderator, Dr. Yizhao Yang and Tao Fan. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ko, and welcome to all of our attendees. We are here for the 4th webinar in our series, Knowledge Infrastructure for Sustainable Cities and Landscapes. This focus is on developing and implementing sustainability policy based on research and science and through shared understandings that allow the implementation in local contexts. I'm going to turn to my co-host and collaborator, Dr. Yizhao Yang, for our introductions.
Hello, everyone. My name is Yizhao Yang. I'm Associate Professor at School of Planning, Public Policy and Management at University of Oregon. Dr. Ann Toffen and I work together to produce a Routledge Handbook that summarizes our multi-year collaboration work and collaborative research among multiple members from the Scl Hub. And today, we're glad to have this opportunity to present some of the research outcome from the book and also use that to launch an outlook and summarize our future visions of the policy research. I'll pass to Dr. Ann Toffen to introduce herself.
Thank you, Dr. Yang. It's so nice to have an opportunity to talk about the edited volume that we've worked on together over the course of several years with over 100 authors in the Research Hub and network that we're going to describe to you tonight. I'm a professor of urban studies at the University of Washington, Tacoma, where a lot of my work is based in policy and planning, and I run a graduate program in community planning. The work that we're going to share with you cuts across disciplines, and it's from regions and universities throughout the Association of Pacific Rim Universities network. And so the collaboration that Dr. Yang and I have been fortunate enough to undertake together has led us, especially through this final era of COVID-19, to reflect upon what's needed to move research into practice and into policy implementation. So an overview of today's session, and then I'll pass to Dr. Yang and she'll tell you about how we're going to move forward. The introduction that we're providing to you right now will be followed by our framework, which we've developed to really focus on frames for policy action. After describing that framework and the context that led to its formulation, along with many of our research colleagues, we'll introduce the Routledge Handbook in more detail and describe to you the process and the different sections for developing understandings around the components that are so crucial for devising sustainable regions and cities in today's world. After that, Dr. Yang will talk with us more about knowledge and informational infrastructures, the kinds of networks and venues for learning and knowledge co-production that are so crucial for building the shared understandings that we are so deeply in need of in today's world. And then we'll complete the evening tonight with some conclusions and thoughts for moving forward, both for us and we hope for you all in your venues and your institutions as well.
Obviously, we have a lot to cover in today's webinar, but before we go ahead, we wanted to set up some rules and then just so that we can ensure we have good interaction, good engagement, and have a wonderful session tonight. So for all of you in the as attendee, we have Q&A box up running, so feel free to type your questions anytime you have, and one of the panelists will monitor the questions and try to answer them periodically. And at the critical juncture between different parts, we'll pause to answer a couple of questions as we go, and just so that we don't wait until the last moment to address those burning questions. But we anticipate most of the question will be answered and addressed after the presentation is completed. We'll turn to the Q&As and then take more questions as time allows. Now, I'm going to pass back to Dr. Ann Toffen, and she'll begin discuss the first part of our today's webinar.
Thank you, Dr. Yang. I want to provide some context for the thought processes and the interactions that have led to the framework and the completion of the chapters that make up the handbook. As most of you, all of us know, we're facing really tremendous pressures around climate change and a warming globe and planet. And that has imposed certain constraints and challenges around what it looks like to plan sustainably for cities. And all of us are living through the effects of a global pandemic. And we're going to talk about how these contexts have really helped us to formulate an understanding of the need for targeted understandings and translating research and science into policy for action. Next slide. So as I mentioned, the first aspect of context that is familiar to all of us is the global pandemic that we have been living through for over a year and a half. The graphic on the lower right-hand side is from Johns Hopkins University, and you've probably seen it in different places, that tracks the number of deaths globally as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. This is ongoing, and we're looking at over 7 million deaths by most estimates. And so not to be a negative or a doomsayer, but it's really an unprecedented time in many of our communities and across the globe for figuring out how to live safely and differently, and to live with foresight and care in terms of protecting ourselves and our neighbors. Essential workers are under tremendous pressures, and many of our events and usual ways of interacting have been canceled. And so it's really led us to reflect on what is required for truly sustainable cities and landscapes that can enable us to weather these sorts of challenges. Next. Another aspect of context, as I mentioned, is the growing specter of global climate change and the increase in extreme weather events, the costs and the damage and destruction that imposes on communities around the world, and events such as wildfires, which we have been experiencing quite a lot of here in the Pacific Northwest, as well as across the Western United States. And we know that Australia also has had really damaging wildfires in the last several years. So protecting life and prosperity and our loved ones through conditions like this have also led us to realize that these are not conditions that are going away anytime soon. And it's really incumbent upon us to make best use of the available science and to build the kinds of networks and understandings that are going to enable us to have livable and prosperous lives into the future. Next. Finally, as urbanists, we are here and embracing the notion that cities are both the challenge and the driver of many of these dynamics that have led to challenging global conditions under urbanization, and also the solution. More than half of the world's population now lives in urbanized areas. Cities are growing rapidly, particularly in the global south, in Asia, and in Africa. And the need to understand how to build more sustainably with reasonable use of resources and high quality of life for the maximum number of people is really an extraordinary challenge that we're facing at this moment in history. Next. Finally, the entire handbook and much of what we're going to be sharing with you tonight is about the intersection between the global goals that have been set by the United Nations, the goals for sustainable development by the year 2030, 17 ambitious, well-operationalized goals with indicators that are very clearly linked to the scientific need to reduce our consumption of resources, to care for people throughout our communities around the globe who do not have adequate access to resources, and to learn together how to implement the kinds of solutions that are going to move us towards the Sustainable Development Goals over the next 10 years, which is a pretty short period of time. So the research that is absolutely necessary for meeting Sustainable Development Goals has to be brought down to the ground and made digestible and implementable at the local level. So Dr. Young is going to talk with us more about the idea of policy mobility and how solutions can potentially move from one place to another, and the important role of sustainability education in reaching the Sustainable Development Goals. So in order to move towards Sustainable Development Goals, as I mentioned, these contextual factors have really led us to think about the need for an integrative framework. We have wonderful, wonderful scholars across disciplines in sustainability research. What is sometimes difficult is an integrating framework that allows us to understand things in common and to move forward in common purpose. And so given the amount of time that we were fortunate enough to be able to spend in conversation and in deep reflection and working through the research with colleagues, we have devised what we hope will be at least a way to start to think about the need to develop what we see as policy frames for action. Next. There are a few things that we think are significant that have motivated us and kept us inspired over the last few years in terms of research and sustainable development. First of all, a lot of sustainability research, whether we're all aware of it or not, has originated largely in Northern Europe and in the Western and Occidental world. This is where urbanization historically has moved forward most rapidly. However, currently, urbanization is most poised to take off and is in fact already taking off in the cities of the global south. So the most rapid growth in population and what we know clearly from the OECD and other global sources is that the most significant urbanization is going to be taking place in areas like China and Southeast Asia and across Africa in coastal megacities. So we have really been intentional about creating a research base in this volume that draws from these locations, that works intentionally to not replicate existing sources of understandings about sustainability, which are wonderful, but are not necessarily drawing from the locations and the cultures and the patterns that are going to be most important as our world continues to grow. The other really different perhaps or significant contribution that we're making here is the fact that ideas matter. And so we have an extensive literature that has shown us that there is no lack of science in terms of creating better policies. What typically is needed are shared understandings. So from a symbolic interactionist standpoint or an interpretive policy standpoint, there's a rich literature tradition here that suggests to us that what we think of as policy frames or causal stories, persuasive stories, the social constructions that go into helping people make sense of reality and take action together are absolutely crucial in making sense of science and in finding shared and common purpose to move towards ambitious and really important goals. Next. So as we mentioned, the pandemic, as for all of you, I'm sure, has been a really important experiential education. You can't avoid it. Many of us are trying to find ways to maintain social distancing, even now as we have new variants surging, and many of us have children that are not yet vaccinated, or we still feel the risk and exposure of this pandemic moving through our communities and our households and our neighborhoods. So the lived experience, moment to moment, day to day, of needing to find new ways to live has perhaps for many of us shown that it is possible and in fact sometimes necessary, whether we like it or not, to find new ways to live. And this is really part of what is going to be absolutely necessary for more sustainable places and regions. So we see the pandemic as being obviously a shared experience, that it is experienced in slightly different ways in different places, but there are some commonalities in terms of the need for public space, the need for places for vaccine delivery to take place, the need for hospitals and facilities, and to continue the relational infrastructure that allows us to take care of one another. It's also been very focusing and helped us to kind of zero in on a number of different related fields, such as sustainability, that are very close to the core interests and matter of dealing with this pandemic. Next. So as one of these key framing ideas that we talked about, that the literature has been so clear in policy are really necessary to get people thinking and acting together, is the notion of health. Now, for public health scholars, this will not come as any surprise. And for many environmental studies and environmental science scholars, this will not come as any surprise. However, the idea of health has really gained purchase and precedence throughout a number of different fields, particularly coming from my training in social ecology, and it's definitely thread through the notions of sustainable urban development, but really it comes from the policy world itself and the global NGOs and on-the-ground practitioners who have started to recognize that health is not just about how somebody turns up in a doctor's office and whether they're passing tests or whether they're positive or negative for a particular disease. That health is really about the environments that we inhabit as human beings, and what are known as the social determinants of health is a term that the World Health Organization has started to use amongst many other groups, including the CDC here in the US. And another term that the World Health Organization has promulgated for going on decades is health in all policies. And so again, the pandemic has really brought this to the fore and shown some of the intersections between sustainable urban development and the notion of health as a human right. And so for sustainability research to be mobilized and used effectively, both for humans and for our environments and for other species, we need to be thinking about health equity, that is creating the conditions and access to resources that enable people and communities to reach and sustain optimal health. Next. Another term that's getting a lot of attention here in the United States at the moment is the idea of infrastructure. What Dr. Yang and I have started to try to do in this volume and in other work that we are working on together and publishing and sharing with many of this framework with many of our colleagues is that infrastructure is not just built roadways and computer systems and energy infrastructure, although that is absolutely essential. As landscape ecologists and urbanists, we are really focused on the blue, green, gray infrastructure of built spaces. So whether it is irrigation district in Chengdu, China that goes back centuries, or more recent recognition of the importance of canals and waterways as multitasking places for people to get exercise and use trails and maintain spots of nature. These are also forms of infrastructure. And something that we'll talk more about and Dr. Yang is going to really focus on in her part of this webinar is the idea of informational infrastructure and the relationships that we have with one another socially and through our institutions and how we maintain those relationships as a really crucial form of infrastructure to either share public health information or to share and develop new understandings that are going to help us to live together into the future. Next. Finally, in trying to take very seriously the cultural context that all of us are inhabiting and the lack of performance, relatively speaking, of current policy models that have been developed largely, again, through Western and global means that frequently carry with them perhaps a level of hubris and or lack of understanding of what the cultural patterns and values are in particular places. We focused on the word cultivation and the idea that in all places around the world, we cultivate relationships with the earth. We use the earth to nourish ourselves, to create places to live, to build relationships in our gardens, on our farms, in our agricultural areas. This is something that is the precursor to urbanization, is that people stayed still enough to tend soil and to create agricultural seasons. And we think that the metaphor of cultivation is actually a really crucial one for policy implementation and for working with contexts in place in actual regions. Next. Finally, before we turn to the volume and a lot of the work that our colleagues have done, the research and the science itself, I'd like to spotlight a volume that was published, many of you may be familiar with, and I'm not an economist, so I'm not going to claim deep familiarity with the pluralist and rational choice theory that Mancor Olson tends to indicate when one mentions the book, The Logic of Collective Action. However, we're using this image here for two reasons. One of them is the collective action is a problem. And all of us, I think, are aware of that for the most part, people need to see their own self-interest before they will adopt to or ascribe to any sense of a collective interest. And if sustainability policy and implementation is anything, it is a collective action problem. So identifying forms of self-interest is really crucial. But one of the other things that Olson is known for in academic circles and kind of at a meta level is the notion of one big idea. That it really takes an idea for a wonderful volume or manuscript, for instance, to get traction and be a classic through the ages. Of course, it helped that he is tremendously brilliant. But the notion of a big idea is one that we are also trying to enlist to help us think about how do we weave together this research from so many different disciplines into frames for action that are coherent, that are legible and actionable. And we'll turn now to Dr. Yang, who is going to tell us more about the volume and the involved process of devising this research base over the last couple of years. Dr. Yang.
Thank you, Anne. Well, here we are after this is almost end of a third year of collaboration, as Anne mentioned earlier, involving more than 100 authors, contributors. And then this is really a collective outcome that we're very proud to share this book's content, preview of the content with you. It's to be published by Routledge as a handbook, and then the tentative publication date is February next year. So what is this book about? First, it draws insights and the lessons from experience of sustainable planning, design, and governance in the Pacific Rim. The current literature has a lot to do with the Euro-America centric sustainable urban development practices and experiences. The Pacific Rim region, particularly on the Asia-Pacific edge, is really an understudied area. And we think this book can really fill the existing gap in the literature. And it also consciously builds connections among sustainability visions, theories, and practices. The authors, the contributors to this book has all shared this common goal of sharing actionable knowledge and trying to transfer knowledge, theories to practices and actions. And then we do so by making contributions or specifically addressing the following three themes. First is connecting cities and its surrounding landscapes, and then looking at persistence of environmental and development inequalities, and also addressing the growing impact of global climate change. And all of those studies and researches in those themes are closely connected to the SDG goals, the 17 goals that proposed by the United Nations. So we hope this book appeals to a wide range of audience, to scholars, researchers, students in a number of disciplines, from landscape architecture, architecture planning, public policy law, urban studies, so on and so forth. Here is a map of the case studies included in this handbook. And as you can see, we're trying to cover as widely as possible in terms of geographic representation, although we are still kind of considering short of having good case studies from Latin America. And that's the area that we're trying to do more in the future. Overall, we have 34 institutions. That's the contributors' affiliation that come from those institutions. And then this book is thematically organized into 9 sections. And then each section has its own section editors. And in the coming slides, you will hear some of them presenting about their section's content, and then explain why those content are organized and curated in such a way. And the case studies presented in this map contain about 60, referenced about 60 cities and regions and countries. And then, as you can see, it's spread across the Pacific Rim region. This is a multi-year collaboration of scholars through the APRU SCL program. And then in the coming slides, we'll hear more about this SCL program and how it helps support collaborative work. And particularly, it also set up a very well-established research framework that has guided our work in this presented in this book. So we'll hear a pre-recorded presentation by Dr. Ye-Kan Ko, and then that will help us know more about this SEO program and then its research framework.
Hello again. On behalf of Bart Johnson, the chair of the International Steering Committee of the APRU Sustainable Cities and Landscapes Hub, and myself as a program director, I'd like to introduce the brief background of the Scl Hub. Under the leadership of the University of Oregon, the Hub started with 7 member universities in 2016. Then we have grown to 19 core members with a broad geopolitical diversity across the Pacific Rim, from Latin and North Americas, Asia, and Australasia. Our SCL International Steering Committee set the 5 shared principles that guide our research direction and activities. First of all, as seen in our core members, we seek broad geopolitical representation across the Pacific Rim. We need this diversity both to be able to learn from each other so we can craft the best local solutions, but also because for sustainability to be achieved, it must be achieved globally. Second, we acknowledge that we have different understandings and contexts for sustainability. The Hub provides an opportunity for us to explore how their unique geopolitical context leads to place-based approaches and goals. We seek to understand the common issues and their unique context and solutions. Third, we address the need of underrepresented communities and vulnerable populations. In particular, we want to contribute to alleviating poverty and inequality, with a particular focus on marginalized populations and places. Fourth, we recognize the centrality of climate change for human societies and Earth systems. We truly understand the urgency of climate change, and we seek actions to tackle this unprecedented crisis. Our committee chair, Bart Johnson, will share our climate declaration in a few minutes. And lastly, we want our work to be transformative. We are a research hub, but our inquiry intended to lead towards on-ground change. This requires both intellectual leadership and engagement with stakeholders, practitioners, business, government, and NGOs. Through our foundational framework that you see on the slide, our investigations focus on four sets of processes: those internal to cities, and those occurring within surrounding landscapes, those occurring across the urban-rural boundaries, and finally, telecoupling, the transfer of goods and services that connects cities to distinct landscapes and economies. We need to link these processes into a unified vision for city landscape mosaics and examine them across interacting suites of issues and their social, ecological, and economic dimensions. We need a multi-scalar and multidimensional approach that looks at city landscape systems comprehensively, as well as at a smaller, more manageable, and actionable levels.
Hello, I'm Dr. Bart Johnson, Professor of Landscape Architecture at the University of Oregon in the United States of America. I'm speaking to you as Chair of the International Steering Committee of the Sustainable Cities and Landscapes Hub, sponsored by the Association of Pacific Rim Universities, or APRU. The SCL Hub is led by an international steering committee representing 16 member universities across the Pacific Rim, including North America, Asia, Australia and New Zealand, Central America, and South America. Like many other organizations, we've identified climate change as the preeminent challenge of our times, and the Hub has put forward a declaration of climate emergency and call to action that I'll read to you today. Humanity has destabilized the global climate system upon which all societies depend. To limit impacts and guard against increasing risks requires solutions that reduce greenhouse gas emissions, draw down excess carbon dioxide through landscape carbon sequestration, and enhance societal capacity to adapt to extreme conditions outside the bounds of past human experience. These solutions must be planned and implemented across entire landscapes, including cities, rural settlements, forests, grasslands, agricultural lands, and wetlands. They must vary by nation and region to align with their biophysical, economic, social, and political contexts, and to optimize cost effectiveness and feasibility. Because cities are both the nexus of human activities and the source of greatest carbon emissions, managing the relationships between cities and the landscapes they rely on for essential resources and services is an essential component of any successful strategy. To implement such solutions, we identify 4 key goals as essential to success. Ecological foundations of life. Protect Earth ecosystems, ecological processes, global biodiversity, and evolutionary potential is the foundation of life's resilience and adaptive capacity. Rights of future generations. Act to ensure that future generations have access to the conditions needed to flourish, including natural resources such as healthy air, clean water, and fertile soils, and cultural support systems that provide security, education, healthcare, shelter, and fulfilling livelihoods and supportive communities. Climate justice. because marginalized communities are disproportionately impacted by climate change, specifically address their vulnerabilities and needs, and actively engage them in resilience and adaptation planning and implementation. Cities embedded in landscapes shift from a tendency to think of cities in isolation of their environments to a conception of continuous landscape mosaics comprised of all landscape types interacting with one another, the hydrosphere, and critically, the atmosphere. We assert these four goals are necessary and mutually reinforcing. Without sustaining the ecological foundations of life, there is no capacity to sustain the rights of future generations. Without ensuring that future generations have the capacity to flourish, efforts to increase climate justice for marginalized communities will be ever more difficult. If we allow marginalized communities to be left behind, we will foster not only human suffering, but conflict and war. Finally, without crafting and implementing strategies across entire landscapes, it will be impossible to jointly satisfy the other three principles due to the pervasiveness of the problems and their interconnectedness. With this call to action, we invite collaborators from all sectors of society, national and local governments, private organizations and public agencies, business and academia, and citizens from all walks of life to join us in transformative partnerships and united efforts. Future generations will judge us by whether we act immediately, decisively, and effectively. With that, I wish you the very best in your contributions to the 25th Conference of the Parties to build and implement the critical work of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. You have the deepest support and appreciation of the SCL Hub for your efforts. Thank you.
Thank you to Dr. Yang and to Dr. Ko, and also to Dr. Johnson for articulating the commitment of the University of Oregon Hub to climate change and also to the UN ideals of making progress on this important issue. It's a great time actually to take one of the questions that has come up in our side panel, where Kyung Lin has asked, would you say that the topic we are discussing today all or mostly are built from and with a focus on the matters of sustainable development goal theory? I would say absolutely. And I think together with the members of the Hub, we have really worked to put the SDGs at the forefront of the research that we've been conducting. And if you take a look eventually at our handbook and also the research that we're going to present in just a moment, all of the section editors and all of our authors have been asked to try to match up their research findings with how they might move us forward on the Sustainable Development Goals. The action and the leadership of the UN through venues such as the one that Dr. Johnson was just describing have been so crucial to making progress on these issues. And what we are trying to do is contribute to that process. One of the ways that we're working to do that is how do we move from research to policy? So if you think about the framework diagram that we were just looking at that was devised and developed through the Hub, thinking about landscape, spatial, and functional relationships and the cross-cutting issues and dimensions that very elegantly and succinctly represents these different issues. We know, again, from empirical research that policy actors and people in communities need more narrower or more, I'm going to say more direct representations, those frames for action. So this is where I'm introducing how we've taken the 9 sections of the handbook that are all driven by that research framework, and you'll see them enumerated here on this slide. The sections 1 to 9 grouped into groups of 3 are effectively responding to those questions of why, what, and how. And the why is health. We all want health. We want health for ourselves. We want health for our families and communities. We want health for the animals in our lives. We want health for the ecosystems and the environments where we're building our lives. And so we talk about the first 3 sections, and you'll hear more about them in a moment. What aspects of health are being addressed here? Vulnerable communities, food and nutrition security, and cities and biodiversity. The what is the built form and the importance of water and energy and green space, which we'll talk again about in a moment. And the how is what we do as policy actors, as planners, as public managers, as citizen activists, as residents and people who care about our world. And that's that notion of cultivation. And whether that's through placemaking, or whether it's through the deployment of technologies in smart and inclusive cities, or whether it's through processes of co-production, which I'll talk more about in a moment, the how we go about doing this is absolutely crucial. I want to thank Grace Graham, who's our student assistant at the Sustainable Cities and Landscapes Hub, for helping us with this diagram and the image, and really trying to make the case that our section overviews are intended to be the building blocks towards frames for action. Next.
I'm Jiwen Chen, Program Head and Associate Professor of Landscape Architecture, Urban Design, and Environment Design at the Design School in Arizona State University. I'm the session editor for the Vulnerable Community sessions. In this session, we investigate the intersectionality between vulnerability, resilience, and climate justice in sustainable cities and communities that are related to the sustainable UN goals. And we look into how sustainability is in the interlinked social, ecological, technological systems, that the social drivers from systemic injustice, institutional injustice in the past has consequences and impacts to the community today, which aggravated their vulnerability to climate change impacts that contribute to climate justice. And we look into how resilience, the concept, is not equal to vulnerability. The resilience is more about ability and capacity from the community within. Therefore, the sustainable communities and cities development is strongly linked to the resilience of the community. And in this section, we have 6 chapters. The introductory essay describes the conception of intersection between systemic vulnerability, computer resilience, climate justice, and sustainability. And the chapter 1, the understanding vulnerability in cities, we look into how the scholars and practitioners from APRU conferences in the past, we discuss the conclusions we discussed about how we conceptualize vulnerability in megacities. The chapter 2, 3, 4, and 5 provides case studies from different countries and in the Asia Pacific region and related to flooding hazards, coastal resilience, like sea level rises, and also in particular Asian populations in Taiwan and then in volatile nature of Indonesia community. And chapter 6 provide a conceptual for how we may move forward to a more sustainable and resilient futures.
Hello, I'm Robert Dybel from the Australian National University, here to discuss food and nutrition security. Food security is too often viewed as either an agronomic problem or a health issue. We need more holistic approaches that treat food security as inextricably linked with dimensions of health and well-being, justice and fairness, and ecological sustainability. Food security is addressed by SDG 2, Zero Hunger, but beyond that, it intersects with just about all of the SDGs. We must attend to the systemic injustices and inequities that exist within and between nations and communities within those nations. We need to acknowledge that food production is constrained by ecological health, and our capacity to produce food depends utterly on our capacity to maintain ecological health. And leading from this, we need to create closed-loop nutrient cycle systems within which the food production system can operate. In the chapters that follow the introduction, the first chapter develops the argument for creating nutrient cycling systems within a closed-loop economy. The next chapter looks at the benefits of designing food systems and food production into the urban fabric. The chapter that follows that looks at a range of novel horticultural practices that humans have created through time and space, and some of the new and emerging practices that might help us on our pathway to food system security into the future. And then the final two chapters are linked. The first one develops a dynamic systems-based approach for understanding food security across scales, and the final chapter applies that at various case studies around the Asia Pacific. Thank you.
Dr. Jennifer Ray Pierce is a political ecologist and urban biodiversity planner at the University of British Columbia, where she runs a lab that works with communities who are engaging directly to protect and restore access to nature in urban environments. The section that Jennifer Ray Pierce edited has presented a framework for cities to address biodiversity at the local, regional, and global scales that centers and maintains equity at its core. She's developed a framework that stresses the interconnectedness of humans as part of, as opposed to separate from nature, and argues that addressing biodiversity loss and social injustice together recognizes that they are very much part of the same processes of urbanization, and that if we address one, we will have better outcomes on the other. Next. Jennifer Ray Pierce's section has brought together 5 different chapters, the first of which introduces their claims and arguments. The second works to operationalize urban biodiversity in a team-written collaborative chapter that offers a guide and a set of indices variables that can be used across different settings to understand the health of a different setting in different cities and regions. She then has elicited a reflection on urban-rural connectivity in Japan, which is a very important theme of the hub, that cities do not exist separate from the landscapes and rural districts that surround them, but have deep and lasting relationships with their hinterlands. And then a chapter that looks at accounting for cities' impacts on biodiversity in the global commons. That is, how does the actions and behaviors of cities affect larger patterns? And then 2 really important chapters about engaging audiences and residents in cities based in the deep relationships and grassroots activism that change understandings and grow coalitions for better natural outcomes in cities.
Section 4, Water, is edited by Dr. Ken Yocum, an associate professor and chair at the Department of Landscape Architecture at the University of Washington. This section begins with recognition that water as material culture is central to everything we do in cities and regions around the world. Water is a strategic resource, as this section's authors studied and researched, and the management of this resource is an activity of highly contested geopolitical terrain. The politics of water is driven by the uneven distribution of water quality, quantity, and accessibility. This section then moves on to discussing ensuring access to clean and reliable source of water is synonymous with water security, which is of critical importance for improving the health of urban communities. Sustainable urban development across the Pacific Rim region will not be achieved without water security. At the end, this section draws on examples from across the Pacific Rim to support the mobilization of action-oriented strategies and practices that will help transform how urban regions manage water for sustainable development. This responds to the calls from UN General Assemblies the Water Action Decade 2018 to 2020. This section has 6 chapters after the first intro essay. The chapter entitled Rejoining Our Urban Waters presents opportunities from policy to design that investigate the potential for the extensive integration of a decentralized urban water management system into existing built environments. The chapter entitled Resilience-Based Planning and Management of Sustainable Coast Cities and Landscapes Using Spatial Temporal Simulation proposes a set of strategies for utilizing simulation and scenario building methodologies to model the change in ecosystem services related to single event and long-term perturbations in weather and climate in the metropolitan region of Busan, Republic of Korea. The chapter entitled Reservoir Urbanism in Shenzhen offers an examination of the complex dynamics of political, economic, and physical forces in the creation and continued expansion of the water supply systems of Shenzhen, China, since its establishment as a special economic zone in 1980. Living on Water is a chapter that describes the researchers' work with the informal community of collaborators in Iquitos, Peru, a community defined by water. The chapter titled A Classic Case of the Struggle to Control a River, Is It Wise to Sacrifice the Social and Ecological Functions of the River for Flood Safety? Examines the case of the Mingang River, which flows through Kaohsiung City in southern Taiwan. It explores the limitations of flood management planning that merely emphasizes the construction of flood control infrastructure and does not take into consideration the potential benefits from perspectives of a larger watershed planning framework. At the end, the chapter entitled Watershed Thinking, Landscape Practices extends this approach, focusing on the potential of integrated strategies for managing urban stormwater.
Hi, my name is McKenna Kaufman. I'm a professor of urban and regional planning at the University of Hawaii at Manoa, as well as the director for the Institute for Sustainability and Resilience. Yakang Ko, associate professor of landscape architecture at the University of Oregon, and the program director for the APRU Sustainable Cities and Landscape Hub, and I co-edited this section entitled Renewable Energy Landscapes Across the Pacific Rim. This work centers on the urgency of the climate crisis, the need for rapid decarbonization, but also highlights some of the challenges in doing so. Climate change motivates rapid deployment of large-scale renewable energy and other climate action to achieve global-scale decarbonization. However, the adoption of new energy sources has and will continue to lead to landscape as well as seascape change, for example, from offshore wind. In multiple chapters, we provide real-world case studies for comparison and illustration of not just the conceptual need for a massive transition to renewable energies, but also to identify specific barriers and their solutions. Chapters 1 and 2 look at a variety of social and technological aspects of energy transition. Chapter 1 by learning from cities across the Pacific Rim that have emerged as leaders in climate action, and Chapter 2 in understanding values that affect the social acceptance of renewable energy policies. Chapter 3 presents case studies that illustrate emerging conflicts from renewable energy impacts to land and seascapes, as well as a planning framework that will help to more proactively address and mitigate these conflicts. The final 3 chapters center on the important technology of solar photovoltaics and present alternative siting considerations that lessen their land use impacts, for example, through pursuing both energy and agriculture via agrivoltaics, as well as to better use a variety of urban spaces. The last chapter emphasizes the importance of a holistic approach to renewable energy materials development, particularly for solar voltaic, as well as the comprehensive approaches to thinking about changing supply chains and community level impacts. This work touches on several UN Sustainable Development Goals, most critically climate action and affordable clean energy. Hi.
This is Section 6, Landscapes for Healthy Living. Dr. Julian Zhang is the group leader for this section. In this section, we are going to follow SDGs' 4 goals from theoretical to evidence-based, design criteria and application link, landscape and human health. We are going to deliver these 4 key information. Nature and urban green space foster psychological and physiological health benefit, related planning and policies, technology and practice. There are 5 chapters in this section. Chapter 1 brings a generational lens to this discussion, highlighting how concepts such as intergenerational nature impacts our region's efforts to bring nature to our population. In the Chapter 2, this chapter aims to engage the readers into inflection by tackling issues and concerns concerning human-nature interaction. Chapter 3 is about the policy. This chapter discusses policy related to urban green space and the different nature environmental scale. In Chapter 4, from the environment to the subjective mental feelings and the objective physical reactions, updating technology support research discuss how and what can the healthy landscape provide benefit to humans. Last, the purpose of the Chapter 5 is to value the knowledge-action gap in the area of landscape and health, identify possible reasons for this gap, and propose possible solutions and research results to call for action.
Hello, I'm Linda Corkery, Professor Emerita at the University of New South Wales in Sydney. Dr. Paula Boren at the University of Auckland in New Zealand and I have co-edited Section 7 of the Handbook under the theme of urban design and placemaking. This section looks at how Pacific Rim cities are working to achieve SDG 11, focused on inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable cities and communities. Key takeaways and the SDGs they touch on include the importance of the interconnectedness of natural and built systems, which provides the basis for sustainable urban design and for creating climate change resilient places, touching on SDGs 11 and 13. Careful design of higher density residential developments needs to deliver high quality housing, shared public spaces with access to green space, also SDG 11. New alternative energy technologies work best when integrated with urban landscapes and built form, and this is SDG 7. Community-generated public spaces should be regarded as expressions of social sustainability and community resilience in high-density cities, and this relates to SDG 3. Section 7 of the Handbook considers the urgency of sustainable urban development, particularly the complex dynamics that emerge between natural and built environments in human settlements. It comprises an introductory essay written by the section co-editors and a further 6 chapters as shown on the slide. Each chapter addresses key urban design challenges and presents examples of strategies and actions being undertaken to achieve SDG 11 in cities and communities across the Pacific. Case studies present project examples at a variety of scales, moving from the regional to the city scale, then to the neighborhood, streetscape, and specific urban places. Thank you.
Our next section focuses on smart, sustainable cities, edited by Dr. Mohsen Mohammed-Zada from the urban planning, directing the urban planning program at the School of Architecture and Planning at the University of Auckland in New Zealand. This section takes a very close look at the social and economic implications of smart city initiatives. What happens when we deploy technologies into specific political and cultural communities, and how does it affect the norms for those places and the experience of the residents? The overall argument that is being put forth by this section is that technological sophistication, while definitely laudable, is not the only marker of a smart city. that in fact supporting, protecting, and sustaining the commons is an essential part of sustainable development. The technology can just as easily erode, polarize, and threaten. So the argument that's being put forth here by all of the chapters is that a smart, sustainable city uses technology to be inclusive, responsive, and responsible to its residents. Next. The chapters included in this section, as mentioned, examine the powerful opportunities to improve response rates to disaster, to improve quality of life, to provide better and faster transport and mobility throughout regions, and to protect and use natural resources more effectively and efficiently. The first chapter, following the introduction, provides a landscape of the evolution of the use of smart technologies across the Pacific Rim, and then specific chapters that look in some detail at the deployment and the outcomes of the use of these technologies in specific settings. Ultimately, there's a very careful, nuanced, and evidence-based set of conclusions that affirm once again that these technologies are not a panacea, that they have certainly provided opportunities for us to move towards sustainability, but that we must do this with care and intentionality. That's fine. The next section I edited, and it's nice for me to have been able to talk about Dr. Motion's section, as I worked with him and with Dr. Jennifer Amparo on a part of the Mayor's Academy in terms of smart and inclusive cities. In my view, the importance of co-production is equally imperative for sustainable cities, and this section starts to develop some of the arguments for why. Co-production, as scholars of public management and institutional economics know, is developed largely, it's associated with Elinor Ostrom and the provision of efficient and effective solutions to policy problems across multiple sectors where it's otherwise challenging for any one agency or actor to solve a wicked problem. There's also a strong argument in co-production for the importance of including people and cultures and norms, priorities, values that may not otherwise be sufficiently engaged in devising local solutions. So we developed a model in this section that emphasizes the identity of places and communities as being essential to the moving forward, the how of cultivation for sustainable development. But based on that accurate identity, we developed the capacity to successfully implement the programs and policies that will move us towards the sustainable development goals. That we then build knowledge that is practical and shared, and that knowledge embeds itself in shared discourses and ways of understanding that can then be passed from person to person, group to group, even generation to generation. Next. So the chapters in this section range from an initial chapter. Jennifer Amparo was the lead author in a very comprehensive survey of higher education institutions that have sustainability curricula across the Pacific Rim, and found that knowledge brokering is really specific to place and really needs to respond to the strengths of that university and the needs of that region. Across the variety of other chapters, we find emphasis on each of the elements that I mentioned on the last slide, the importance of discursive understandings and the narratives that are carried forward, that people build and sustain with one another as far as what matters to them and then what drives policy action and implementation. That these narratives are representative of identity and consistently represent with accuracy, if in a multi and variegated way, very complex realities on the ground, both for human communities as well as for the natural environments and the topography and the natural history of that region. The capacity that grows out of centering the strengths of particular groups, and then the knowledge that's grown from that. Next. So these 9 overviews of the different sections, as we mentioned, are intended to be first steps at functioning as evidence narratives to guide collective action. When we think about what's next for research, both for the Hub and for all of us as scholars, this group and Dr. Yang and I as editors are thinking very carefully about what we need to do to build the infrastructures for action going forward. I come from a tradition that is interpretive policy and really emphasizes this significance of framing. And so some of the reflections that I have about this volume and things that we are thinking about as we move forward include really foregrounding the question of what do we mean by sustainability? It is one of these wonderful wide open words that is like justice or love or democracy that really depends upon who's asking and who's answering. And so it's really up to policy communities to define and prioritize what their needs and imperatives are. The other thing that comes up very clearly from the over 60 chapters and over 100 authors that we've worked with very closely over the last couple of years is that collaboration across sectors and scales really requires some shared commitments. These have to do with the norms and values that we hold dear, why we prioritize the things that we do. And so the importance of building these cultural commitments is not an afterthought. It really needs to be at the fore of successful collective action. Finally, unfortunately, and really disturbingly, we know through research and through evidence, and for some of us through experience, that narrative will trump evidence and organized action. So while we are all committed researchers and we love the work that we do, gathering data and evaluating it against our hypotheses, at the end of the day, political action really depends upon frames that cohere and make sense to people. And a lot of times those frames are drawn from our own experiential commitments and biases. And that is something we can lament, or we can simply work to mobilize it so that we feel that prioritizing interpretation and sense making for the common good is one of the most important things that we can do to move forward towards the Sustainable Development Goals. You might think of our intro essays as policy narratives, and we are very fortunate to have received funding from APRU to make these open access through Routledge. There was a question about the availability of this volume. Each of those intro essays that was introduced by a section editor will be free and available to the public. So if you would like to read in more detail the content of the section that follows and learn for yourselves the vision and the understandings that each section editor has, we encourage you to keep an eye out for the publication of our volume and hopefully download and make use of those intro essays, because they are meant to be circulated and to help to highlight the wonderful work of all of our collaborators and the researchers who have been part of this process and very committed over a very challenging period of time. Next. I'm going to turn now to Dr. Yang, who is going to walk us through the potential and wonderful ideas behind informational infrastructures and knowledge co-production. Dr. Yang?
Thank you, Dr. Taufan. I think after hearing so much about this book, I'm very excited. I think people in the audience might feel similarly about the quantity of and the amount of work we have been able to produce over the last few years and with this large collaboration. But our work doesn't stop here. So this is what I want to discuss in this section, is about this book and our effort. It is really just a building block in what we call information and knowledge infrastructures for policy, mobility, and sustainability education. So think about the common words that we've heard from all the section editors, from Ye Kang, the program director, from Dr. Taufan, about our work. Probably a few words come to be mostly frequently mentioned: mobilization, scales, global to local, actions, transformative changes. So this is really characterize our shared common goals. We're producing knowledge, not just for the knowledge per se, but we wanted to see the knowledge translate to actions and translate to changes, not just focus on the cases we've studied, but also other places where they're in need for similar changes, for similar issues and problems. So this is what we call policy mobility. Is important for us to share knowledge, exchange knowledge, and also in that process, translate knowledge and experience from producing other places, but and adapt it into a new area, localize it, and then make it to be a context-sensitive new approach to address local issues. So here, I want to mention two areas that we really could use the knowledge and information infrastructure. One for policy mobility, the other for sustainability education. For the policy mobility, we wanted to see the flows of information in the global circuits of knowledge that can enable adaptive policy reform innovation. And the policy actors who are acquiring the knowledge, acquiring the information from us or from practitioners or from their stakeholders, from other their counterparts, we hope they can emulate the policy they've learned and apply them with adequate efficacy and then efficiency. And then we wanted to have support and create infrastructure to support that learning process, what we call creating different learning spaces for those policy actors to acquire the necessary knowledge and information. And second, for sustainability education, we want to see the knowledge that we produce, co-produced, and we applied can help a series of group of people, from citizens to students to practitioners, to be able to enable them to identify solutions to meet the needs of both the human and environmental systems. So here I wanted to address these two areas one by one. Looking at how we can use informational infrastructure to support policy mobility, and then thinking about this is a circular process where we have mobile objects, that's the policy knowledge that's successfully co-produced by agents that include us, researchers, educators, and specialists and practitioners, and with the support of the institution and necessary technology, that we create these three types of learning spaces that will allow the policy actors to acquire, to understand, to apply and translate those information knowledges to their local condition and local issues. And then at the end, what we're hoping to see is the global circuits of policies of different topics. Right now, we are already seeing the global circuits where eco-urbanism policies supporting eco-urbanism is being circulated. And then you can see cities in China, cities in European countries, they are applying similar kind of eco-urbanism or policies and strategies. Similarly, housing strategies, smart cities, urban renewal, sustainable cities, sustainable transportation, there are a lot of those topically oriented circuits that have the mobile policy information and ideas that translate from one city to another. And here are a couple of examples I want to use to illustrate what we call the different learning spaces and how we can use informational infrastructure to support them. Policy discourse, informal or formal, through literature research, through sharing information in conferences. Policy tourism, here is an example of using Portland as one of the most popular policy tourist destination. And then there are already organizations, agencies that set up to help support that policy tourism and in this particular destination. And Policy Academy, where we have curriculum set up here. Dr. Tolfin mentioned earlier, at APRU SCL, a lot of the faculty and members are actually actively engaged in this Asian Pacific Mayor's Academy, trying to help mobilize policy ideas, help translate ideas to specific contexts and circumstances. And the other area is how we can use the knowledge and information we produce to help support sustainability education. This is using the competency-oriented idea to think about what kind of a knowledge, what kind of information we should be presented, we should disseminate, and we should use as our teaching materials for our students, and also for help with the practitioners and professionals, and also use different pedagogical, more competency-oriented pedagogical approaches to help with the sustainability community leaders. So how can we do better? So building the information infrastructure involves what kind of knowledge we should produce, how we can produce them most successfully. The notion of a co-production really applies effectively here. So that means we need to follow the principles of successful knowledge co-production. Knowledge should be produced that's context-based. And then when you produce knowledge that's incorporated multiple perspectives, and it's researched or analyzed through a goal-oriented approach, and then it's interactive, and then with ongoing re-examination of the information knowledge that's being produced. And not just about how we produce knowledge and how we circulate the knowledge, how we disseminate them also matters whether we can produce this very strong, effective, efficient informational infrastructures. Here, there are 3 traps that we have identified for researchers to consider to avoid. First, avoid narrow focus on successful cases. There's a general bias toward presenting best practices, workable experiences, but understudy the failures. Actually, we can learn a lot also from the failed experiences. Biased geographic representation is another issue that's very much encountered in current literature. There's a tendency to focus on the mega cities, the global cities, and use their experiences and knowledge, insights, and hopefully to translate those to much smaller cities. There is this geographic bias may limit the applicability of the information or knowledge we've generated. And then finally, the littoral impartation without adaptive localization. This is really important for the researchers, and then also researchers engaged in some of the policy mobility space to understand that in order to localize the existing knowledge and information, we really need to work with the policy actors, work with the local stakeholders, trying to understand those imported policies and to make them mobile effectively. Finally, we use information in teaching and training and use competency-oriented pedagogy. Think about, we make information more accessible, and think about we use the knowledge that was successfully co-produced, and then we use research-informed teaching, and then the teaching materials can be problem-based, solution-oriented, and that will make the teaching process more effective and make the learning outcomes to be more successful. Now I'm going to pass back to Dr. Toffen and then to talk about part 5 that will conclude our presentation.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Young. Hard to believe that we're coming to the end both of the volume and this webinar. Thank you very much for being here with us this evening for us, and at various times for you all, wherever you are today. I just also want to thank Dr. Young for the tremendous opportunity to work with her over the last couple of years. Dr. Young's experience in many of the spaces that she's just laid out for all of us it exceeds my own. And so it's been a wonderful learning opportunity, and she's been very gracious to share her time consistently over the last few years as I try to catch up in these more global spaces. So I'm very fortunate to also be an ongoing learner and co-learning all the time. And I think that's why many of us get into this work to begin with, because we love the curiosity and the potential to keep ourselves alive and just newly wondering all the time, both at the world itself and the opportunities there are for acting together. I want to just summarize quickly what we're hoping to do with what is admittedly a very voluminous handbook on sustainable cities and landscape in the Pacific Rim. That this is the nature of research in the year 2021. There are tremendous numbers of people doing extraordinarily good work around the globe. And so the challenge around knowledge is really less about gathering data and information than it is about creating understandings and frames that make sense to people, not only those of us fortunate enough to occupy spaces in the academy and in international NGOs, but people on the ground who need to make these changes and produce the interventions that are going to move us towards the SDGs. So I really want to emphasize that in our presentation of these 3 different ideas, first, the idea of health, second, the idea of infrastructure, and third, the idea of cultivation, what we're saying is that we need notions that help things hang together. That as human beings coming from lots of different sectors, the need for interpretation is really central. It cannot be an afterthought, that researchers need to be working more closely throughout the process to craft knowledge-based understandings that are going to be resonant with and able to be picked up by leaders and citizens that have their specific competencies in the places where they live. Dr. Young.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Toffen. Well, I want to use this last slide just to re-emphasize the importance of being reflective of our work, and then considering we as one of the players to build that knowledge and information infrastructure to support mobilization ideas to help with sustainability education. So here we, as most of the members of this hub, we consider ourselves as researchers, but we can simultaneously be trainers to work with the committee members to participate in the training sessions with the community leaders and citizens. We are also important, we're translators. We need to help them understand the policies, understand the failures, understand the context-sensitive approach to policymaking. Of course, we are teachers. We teach in the university, but we're simultaneously students because we are going through the co-learning process with everyone we encountered during our research in the training session with community leaders. And fundamentally, ultimately, we are the citizens that we ought to be the transformative agents that play a role in building the informational infrastructure. So here, reiterate what knowledge and information infrastructure consists of. Here are the three components: knowledge, information, individuals, including us, and then the supporting infrastructure, institution, organization, technology. I'm going to send back to Anne.
Thank you. Just very briefly, we're so glad that you're able to join us tonight. When we look forward, Dr. Young, Dr. Ko, all of us in the hub, I think we're thinking of trying to build from our strengths in our different positions in our universities and in our regions, that doing so needs to be science-based, that speaking as a researcher, for all of us who are doing primary research, we want that research to be used. We feel that it's important and necessary, but that it also needs to be context-based and responding to these regions and places, and interpretive, so that crafting the evidence narratives that help people move forward together is really crucial. So we'll leave you with that idea that the three different kinds of learning spaces that Dr. Young has so elegantly laid forth for all of us really allow us to move through forms of resilient infrastructure at all scales, global, regional, and local. And I guess we'll turn back to Dr. Ko perhaps to conclude, or we'll take our questions and answers. We'll do questions and answers now.
Thank you so much, Dr. Yang and Dr. Tao-Fan, for this fantastic webinar. Yeah, this was really wonderful to see all the efforts that you have done for the handbook and how it came out, really for the co-production of the knowledge for the sustainable cities and landscapes for the Pacific Rim. So I'd like to, thank you again for everything. And so for everyone, I'd like to remind you our next webinar 2 weeks from now, hosted by Professor Linda Cochrane and Kate Bishop from UNSW about children and youth and environment. So please join us again for the following webinar. And I hope to continue to see you until the mid-December. Okay, so thank you so much and see you next time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Please keep a lookout for the handbook. We look forward to sharing it with you.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. Okay, I don't think there are more questions. Mostly people are signing up. We are almost at the end of the time mark.
There was a question there about closed loop economy. I know we ran out of time. I do teach urban governance, and I'd be interested to talk with whoever posted that. You're welcome to email me. The idea of developing and devising local economic solutions, and
And the older recording will be available as soon as it's ready, and we will share with everyone. Yeah. Okay, if nothing else, then yeah. See you in 2 weeks.
Yep. Thank you for attending this webinar. Bye.
Bye.
I think that one okay.